The night began like any other, with polished silver catching the glow of chandeliers and voices lowered to a murmur. But behind the velvet walls a storm was already forming, waiting for one small act to tear through the illusion of grace. What unfolded inside was not chance, but a collision of arrogance, silence, and unexpected courage. A sequence of events that forced hidden cruelty into the light and turned a single decision into a turning point no one could ignore. Watch closely as this story unfolds, because the deepest twist hides in plain sight, and when it arrives, it will force you to question everything you thought you understood. If stories like this draw you in, remember to like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from and how the plot struck you. Langston Pryor had always known that power revealed itself in subtle ways, not just in balance sheets or headlines, but in the tiny fractures of everyday life. And that night when he walked into the cradle, he intended to witness those fractures firsthand. The cradle was not just any restaurant. It was one of the crown jewels of his own holdings, though no one there knew it. Langston had deliberately concealed his identity, choosing the anonymity of a plain navy hoodie, jeans worn thin at the knees, and sneakers with scuff soles. To any observer, he was just another tired traveler, maybe someone killing time before catching a bus out of Charleston. But beneath that disguise stood a man whose signature could shift markets and who had received, just 2 weeks earlier, a letter that unsettled him more than any financial crisis. That letter alleged that the cradle, known in glossy magazines as the epitome of Southern elegance, was in truth a den of racial bias and quiet cruelty, where black customers were humiliated and black employees broken down. He had not built his life by ignoring whispers, and so here he was, entering the lion's den without entourage, without protection, seeking truth alone. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the perfume of wealth and privilege. Candlelight flickered against velvet drapes, gold-trimmed glasses caught the glow, and each conversation hummed with the smug quiet of those who had never been told no. Langston felt the shift the moment he crossed the threshold, the way the hostess's eyes raked across his clothes, cataloging every thread as if each flaw in his appearance marked him unworthy. She wore her posture like armor, chin high, clipboard clutched tight, and though her smile curved politely, her eyes dismissed him before she spoke. "We're fully booked," she said in a tone that was both final and dismissive. Then, after a pause, as though against her better judgment, she added, "But we can seat you near the kitchen doors." Langston gave her nothing in response but a calm nod. He had expected no better, and in fact, he had hoped for exactly this. Bias did not scream. It dripped in controlled tones. It placed you by the restroom. It stripped you of a candle on your table. He followed her through the dining room, past tables of white diners dressed in silk and wool, men with cufflinks, women with pearls, voices lowered to maintain their sense of exclusivity. Not a single black diner filled those seats, but every black face was in uniform. Servers balancing trays, busboys clearing glasses, backs bent in quiet labor. On the walls hung portraits of Confederate officers, carefully unlabeled, their cold gazes softened only by dim lighting that tried to disguise history as heritage. The hostess stopped at a small table beside swinging service doors, where every opening released the sharp scent of bleach. She dropped the menu in front of him with mechanical detachment, no candle, no gesture of welcome. Langston sat calm as ever, his eyes surveying the stage before him. This was not hospitality. This was performance, a theater where whiteness occupied the seats of power, while blackness existed only in service. 10 long minutes passed before anyone came to his table, and when she finally did, Langston knew immediately she was different. She moved with grace, but not the kind that sought applause. It was a careful grace, born of survival. Her shoes were worn down at the edges, her uniform slightly faded, and though her expression was composed, her eyes carried a depth of fatigue. The name tag pinned to her chest read Marvette. When she greeted him, her tone was polite, but her gaze lingered in a way that told him she saw more than most allowed themselves to admit. For a moment, their eyes locked, and though neither spoke beyond the routine exchange, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition. He ordered simply at first water and bread, and she left with a professional nod. but Langston felt her glance one more time over her shoulder before she disappeared into the current of the dining room. The minutes crawled. Langston, accustomed to pressure in hostile boardrooms, knew how to wait. He scanned the room again, watching as the manager, a white man with slicked back hair and a politician's smile, made his rounds, shaking hands with wealthy patrons, laughing too loudly at their jokes, never once glancing toward the man seated alone by the service doors. Langston's stillness was deliberate. Sometimes silence spoke louder than any demand, and in that silence, he tested the culture around him. Then, almost imperceptibly, the moment came. Marvette returned with his water, set it before him with the same practiced motion she offered every guest. And yet, in the movement of her other hand, something shifted. As she cleared the bread plate, her wrist flicked gently, sliding something beneath the porcelain edge with a dexterity so refined that no one else in the room would have noticed. Langston's eyes, sharp and unyielding, did not miss it. A folded linen napkin now rested discreetly beneath his plate, tight and purposeful. Marvette didn't linger, didn't make eye contact, didn't break stride. She simply moved on, her back straight, shoulders squared, as though she had done nothing unusual at all. Langston waited until she disappeared beyond a pair of laughing diners before he reached forward, his fingers brushing the soft cloth. He pulled the napkin into his palm with the care of someone handling a live wire. The fabric was smooth, luxurious, a symbol of refinement, but the ink scratched across it shattered that illusion. For words bled unevenly through the fibers, written in haste, the letters jagged. Today they spit in your food. For a man who had weathered betrayals, who had seen companies rise and fall under the weight of hidden agendas, it was rare for words to cut him deeply. Yet in that moment, his fork remained suspended in the air, and for the first time that night, his composure wavered. Inside had been a letter, typed in a shaky but deliberate font, and its accusations were blunt. Black customers at the cradle were being humiliated, routinely seated in the worst spots, served late, sometimes given food tainted with contempt, while black employees were pushed harder, punished more, and silenced when they spoke up. And though Langston had grown used to whispers about competitors or gossip about markets, this letter carried a different weight because the cradle wasn't just another restaurant. It was part of his empire, a brand that bore his name, even if the world didn't know it. He could have ignored it, sent in lawyers to demand explanations, or hired consultants to conduct a sanitized review. But that wasn't his way, because Langston Pryor believed in seeing rot with his own eyes, not through reports or polished statements. And so he made a choice that shocked even his closest advisors. He bought a bus ticket, boarded alone, traveled without security or entourage, and stepped into Charleston unnoticed, blending into the ordinary so he could watch how the extraordinary unfolded when the mask of civility slipped. The memory of that bus ride clung to him as he sat in the cradle. He had chosen Greyhound deliberately, avoiding flights or private cars, because anonymity was a shield. And as he rode through small southern towns, staring out at cracked sidewalks and faded billboards, he thought of his own beginnings. A boy raised by his grandmother in a small Alabama town where the lights sometimes went out because bills couldn't be paid, where his mother scrubbed floors so he could walk into school with a shirt that didn't shame him, where his first computer had come from a church donation bin, secondhand and scratched, but powerful enough to open a door he had sprinted through. He had built his empire not by forgetting that past, but by burning it into his bones. Every memory of humiliation turned into fuel for precision, every doubt into discipline. And so when that letter landed on his desk, he didn't see just allegations. He saw his childhood reflected in every line. He saw the boy who had once been underestimated walking into the cradle and being seated by the kitchen doors because he didn't look the part. Langston sipped his water slowly, his expression unreadable to anyone watching. But behind his calm exterior, he was replaying the details of the letter, the careful descriptions of managers who ignored complaints, chefs who laughed as they sent out ruined dishes, the way employees of color were scheduled double shifts while their white counterparts coasted through easier hours, the way tips were stolen or tables reassigned to keep the black staff in their place, and the words that haunted him. Most were these: "This is not broken policy. This is the culture." That was why he had come, because culture couldn't be changed with memos or press releases. Culture had to be seen, and he had seen enough tonight to know the letter had told the truth, from a hostess who had looked at his hoodie like it was an insult to the manager who pretended he didn't exist. Marvette's warning had only confirmed what he suspected, and now as he scanned the dining room, he understood the stakes more clearly than ever. This was no longer about food. It was about dignity, about the quiet violence of being told in 100 subtle ways that you didn't belong. And Langston knew something else, something that kept his pulse steady when others might have erupted. This was not the first time. The Cradle had built its reputation on exclusivity, on Southern charm polished to a shine, but beneath the surface, it had been allowed to rot, and now it was his responsibility to decide how deep the cuts would go. Because as the owner, he could burn the place down or rebuild it, and whichever path he chose would ripple far beyond these velvet walls. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an old burner model he used for trips like this, nothing that could be traced, nothing that would reveal who he truly was. And he ignored it for now, letting the moment linger. He thought again of his journey here, of walking into the restaurant unnoticed, of being seated in the worst place, and he realized something powerful. This disguise had not been just about finding the truth, it had been about becoming the truth, about reminding himself what it meant to walk into a world designed to doubt him, to reduce him, to push him into the shadows. Because no matter how many billions he controlled, no matter how many boards he sat on, when he stripped away the armor of wealth, he was still a black man in America, and that truth would always follow him into rooms like this. Langston watched Marvette glide between tables, her face calm, but her movements sharper than before, as if carrying an invisible weight. He wondered how long she had been enduring this, how many times she had watched food spat on, tips stolen, dignity crushed, how many times she had bitten her tongue to keep her job, and how many nights she had gone home carrying the quiet shame of silence. Tonight, she had chosen differently. Tonight, she had taken a risk, and in doing so, she had handed him a weapon stronger than any lawsuit or statement. A napkin with 4 words, written in haste, but carrying the weight of centuries of exclusion. Langston leaned back, blending into the shadows of the dining room, his expression unchanged, his hand steady. To anyone watching, he was just another customer with a glass of water, but inside he was calculating, constructing the next moves. And he knew with certainty that the moment he stepped into this place, the line had already been drawn. The Cradle wasn't just a restaurant, it was a mirror. And tonight it had shown him the reflection of a system that still thrived on dividing black and white, on reminding one side of its place and rewarding the other with privilege. He had seen enough, and he wasn't going to look away. Candlelight glowed against velvet drapes, every table dressed in starched white linen, silverware aligned with military precision, and the hum of conversation hovered at the perfect pitch to suggest sophistication. But beneath that surface lay the silent segregation that defined the place. Every diner he could see was white, their attire a catalog of wealth. Bespoke suits, diamond necklaces, designer handbags casually slung over chairs as though worth no more than grocery totes. And their voices carried a confidence born not just of money, but of entitlement. On the walls hung large oil portraits of Confederate officers, unnamed but unmistakable, their stiff uniforms and stern gazes framed in gilt. And though the restaurant had chosen not to label them, the decision to display them at all was a label in itself, a declaration of who this space truly honored. Langston let his eyes move slowly from table to table, noting the way servers lingered longer at groups that flashed Rolexes, the way the manager, Clifton Morrow, leaned in with exaggerated warmth when speaking to an elderly white couple. His laugh so forced it grated against the hum of the room, and yet in all his rounds, in all his cheer, his gaze never once drifted toward the black waitress moving silently between tables or toward the solitary man in the hoodie near the kitchen doors. It was as if Langston and Marvette both did not exist, except as background noise to the performance unfolding in the center. The smell of expensive wine wafted from glasses as bottles of Bordeaux and Napa Cabernets were poured tableside, and Langston watched the way the white diners glanced at him from time to time, quick looks that carried suspicion, disdain, or at best indifference. The way one man adjusted his cufflinks after catching sight of Langston's sneakers, as though needing to reassure himself of the difference between them. The hostess passed by with her clipboard, her spine rigid, her chin tilted upward, never meeting his eye, her entire posture communicating that he was a disruption to the order of the room, tolerated only because she had been unable to refuse him outright. Langston understood this theater because he had seen versions of it his whole life, from the country clubs that quietly denied membership to the black entrepreneurs who had more money than half the roster, to the boardrooms where he had walked in as the youngest and darkest face only to be mistaken for an assistant. The cradle was no different. It was just more honest in its disguise. It did not need to raise its voice to exclude. It relied on centuries of silent signals, placement of tables, portraits on the walls, which faces were served with deference and which with delay. Marvette moved like a shadow, quiet and efficient, her smile practiced but never genuine. And Langston realized she had learned the art of survival in spaces like these, blending just enough to keep her job while never truly being seen. He could see the lines of exhaustion in her movements, the way she anticipated the snap of a finger or the dismissive wave of a customer before it came, and he knew instinctively that the warning she had given him had come from years of watching, of swallowing injustice, until one moment broke her silence. Langston respected that courage more than he could say, because it was not just about him and the contaminated steak. It was about her decision to risk everything in a space designed to punish people like her for daring to speak. As the evening continued, Langston noted the rhythms of the dining room. White patrons walked in, were greeted warmly, often by name, and ushered to the best tables near the windows or beneath chandeliers, while every black staff member remained in motion, silent, heads slightly bowed, bodies weaving between wealth and history, without ever being acknowledged, as belonging to the same world. He watched a young white couple arrive late without a reservation, and yet within minutes they were seated at a prime table, the hostess smiling as though welcoming family, while just an hour before she had looked at him with near contempt for daring to ask the same. This was not coincidence, not oversight, it was design. Langston thought back to his childhood in Alabama, to the segregated spaces his grandmother had told him about, the ones where black families were allowed only through the back door, where their labor was welcomed but their presence at the table was not. And he realized the cradle was simply a modern incarnation of those same walls, draped in velvet instead of painted signs, exclusion baked into customer service scripts and staff training rather than written into law. He clenched his jaw but kept his composure, because rage would reveal him too soon, and he had not come to explode. He had come to expose. Every smirk from Clifton, every delay in service, every portrait on the wall was evidence, and Langston knew how to collect evidence better than anyone. The kitchen doors swung open again, releasing the sharp tang of bleach and the laughter of cooks, and for a moment Langston caught sight of the chef, Derek Vance, his white coat smeared with sauce. His expression twisted in a grin that suggested cruelty was his seasoning of choice. The sous chef, Eldon Pritchard, stood beside him, their exchange inaudible, but their laughter loud enough to pierce the hum of the dining room. And Langston suspected already that what Marvette had written on that napkin was not an isolated act of contempt, but part of a ritual repeated in that kitchen, hidden behind swinging doors, away from the eyes of patrons who paid $700 for a steak without realizing the rot that flavored it. While white servers were rotated fairly, given prime sections near the chandeliers and the window seats where tips flowed easily, Marvette was consistently placed at the worst tables, the cramped corners by the kitchen doors or the restroom, the places where guests sat briefly and tipped poorly. And whenever a mistake occurred, a misplaced order, a dish sent back cold, it somehow always became her responsibility. Her manager, Clifton Morrow, with his slick hair and false smile, would call her into his office, not to reprimand her directly, but to remind her with veiled threats that she should be grateful for the job, that plenty of others would take her place, that loyalty meant swallowing pride. Marvette had not always been here. Just 3 years earlier, she had been a law student at Howard University, her eyes set firmly on the path to becoming a civil rights attorney, a dream fueled by stories her grandmother told her about marches and sit-ins, about the bravery of people who risked everything so voices like hers could be heard. She had been halfway through her degree when her mother was diagnosed with aggressive cancer, the kind that consumed not only the body, but the family's finances with brutal efficiency. Overnight, her scholarship seemed like a pebble against an avalanche. Bills piled higher than she could climb, and the decision, though heartbreaking, was simple. She withdrew from school, packed her belongings into a single suitcase, and returned to Charleston to care for her mother and to find whatever work would keep them afloat. The cradle offered her a paycheck, and at the time that was enough. But what she didn't anticipate was how the restaurant itself would grind down her spirit, not just with long hours and heavy trays, but with the daily cuts of casual cruelty that came from both customers and colleagues alike. She learned quickly that laughter in the kitchen was rarely innocent. She remembered one evening when Chef Derek Vance, amused by his own joke, suggested serving undercooked meat to a black couple because, as he put it, they wouldn't know the difference. She had stood frozen, tray in hand, her lips pressed into a tight line as the sous chef Eldon Pritchard cackled. And though the couple never learned what had been said, Marvette carried that memory like a scar. She remembered nights when tips she had clearly earned mysteriously vanished from her till, only to find that one of the senior white servers had mistakenly claimed the table as theirs. Complaints went nowhere, and eventually she stopped filing them. She wore her uniform like armor, covering bruises that were invisible but heavy, and she told herself each morning that she would endure one more shift because her mother needed her, and because the alternative, unemployment, instability, shame, was worse. But enduring did not mean she was blind. Marvette noticed everything. The way the hostess Tamsin Hale stiffened when black customers walked through the door, the way Clifton adjusted his smile depending on the color of the guests he greeted, the way other servers snickered when she was assigned double shifts. She noticed the portraits of Confederate generals on the walls, not labeled but displayed like trophies, and she understood the message they carried even if no one else spoke it aloud. She noticed how not a single black diner sat among the sea of wealthy white patrons, except when someone like Langston Pryor, disguised in his hoodie, slipped in and disrupted the symmetry. She noticed, and she remembered, and though she rarely spoke of it, her silence was not weakness. It was survival. Yet silence had its limits, and tonight Marvette felt those limits pressing against her ribs. From the moment she saw Langston seated near the service doors, she felt something different. He did not look like the typical diner, did not bark orders or glance at his watch impatiently, did not wear the armor of wealth that most customers displayed so casually. Instead, he sat with an unsettling stillness, his eyes observant, his demeanor calm, and when she approached his table he looked directly into her eyes, not past her, not through her, but at her. That moment was small, invisible to everyone else, but to Marvette it was seismic, a crack in the mask she had been forced to wear for years. Someone saw her, truly saw her, and the recognition stirred something dangerous inside her. Courage. She thought of the countless times she had walked past cruelty without speaking, the time she had carried contaminated plates to customers because she feared losing her job, the time she had swallowed back rage as Clifton berated her for things she had not done, the time she had gone home with her back aching and her pride bruised, whispering to herself that tomorrow she would quit, but never doing it because tomorrow always came with bills. And tonight, as she saw Langston's calm watchfulness, as she remembered Derek's smirk in the kitchen and Eldon's laugh, she realized she could not remain silent forever. Tonight, the balance tipped. She returned to the kitchen, her hands trembling only slightly as she carried empty glasses, and she overheard Derek once again joking crudely about reminding people of their place. Something inside her snapped. She knew she couldn't scream it aloud, couldn't march into the dining room and shout the truth, because she would be fired before her words even reached the chandelier. But she could do something else, something small but irreversible. She slipped a napkin from the rack, snatched a pen from her apron pocket, and with hurried strokes wrote the words that had burned in her throat for months. Today they spit in your food. She folded it tightly, pressed it flat, and carried it out with the poise of a server who had done this 1,000 times. Except this time the tray in her hands carried not just water, but truth. As she approached Langston's table, she steadied her breathing, masking the pounding of her heart. She placed the glass before him with professional ease, and as she cleared his bread plate with one hand, her other hand slid the folded napkin beneath the porcelain edge. No words, no glance, no sign. She turned and walked away, her posture unbroken, her face neutral, but inside her veins burned with adrenaline and fear. Would he read it? Would he understand? Would this be the end of her job, of her fragile stability? She didn't know. All she knew was that silence had finally become unbearable, and tonight she had chosen risk over endurance. He reached for the menu, his eyes scanning deliberately, and when the waitress returned, he ordered with a steady voice, his words measured, each syllable chosen to test the limits of the system before him. "The presidential prime," he said, his tone even, his gaze unflinching, medium rare, with a glass of the 2005 Stag Lynn Cabernet. It was a dish few dared to order, a spectacle rather than a meal. 48 ounces of bone-in Wagyu beef dry-aged for 90 days, paired with truffle sides and carried to the table beneath a rosemary smoked dome lifted with a flourish by gloved hands. It cost $700, the kind of price that ensured only hedge fund managers, senators, or the wealthy elite ever requested it, and the wine alone added another $200 to the bill. In that moment the room seemed to pause, and Marvette blinked, her practiced composure faltering for the briefest second. She repeated the order quietly, almost as if to make sure she had heard correctly, then nodded with professional grace. But Langston did not miss the way her breath caught, the way her hand gripped the pen tighter. Across the room, Clifton Morrow's gaze locked onto them, his posture stiffening, his arms folding across his chest as he leaned near the bar, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He knew the rules as well as anyone. When a customer who looked questionable placed an order of that magnitude, protocol demanded pre-authorization, a credit card secured before the kitchen began. It was a policy rarely enforced against white patrons, but it became iron law when the diner was black, dressed in clothes deemed beneath the establishment's image. Clifton's lips pursed, his jaw tightening as he nodded subtly toward Marvette, a silent reminder of what was expected. She carried the order slip to the POS terminal, her pulse hammering in her ears, and when the screen flashed red, requiring manager approval, she hesitated. Her training screamed at her to follow procedure, to fetch Clifton, to demand payment up front or risk being written up. But the memory of Langston's eyes, calm and resolute, the memory of the folded napkin she had just slipped him, burned hotter in her chest. With a steadying breath, she pressed override, swiped her own ID, and authorized the order herself. She had just taken personal responsibility for a dish worth nearly $1,000 with wine, and if the payment failed, if anything went wrong, she alone would carry the blame. In the dining room, Langston sipped his water as if nothing unusual had happened, his face unreadable, but he caught Clifton's movement out of the corner of his eye as the manager straightened, glaring at Marvette with open displeasure. She returned to the floor, her tray balanced in her hands, but Langston could see the tension in her shoulders, the courage it took to defy the silent rules of this place. He respected her more in that moment than many executives he had mentored. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Derek Vance and Eldon Pritchard had already caught wind of the order. Derek smirked, his lips curling in cruel amusement, and muttered something crude about people trying to act like they belong. Eldon laughed, their voices carrying over the sizzling pans, the mockery evident in every syllable. For them, the presidential prime wasn't just a dish, it was an opportunity, a chance to reinforce the silent hierarchy they lived by, to remind both staff and customers who truly belonged at the cradle and who didn't. Back on the floor, Marvette delivered bread and water to another table, but her thoughts churned with dread. She had overridden the system, defied Clifton's unspoken command, and risked her job for a man she barely knew, yet something in Langston's calm demeanor had told her it was worth it. She had seen him watching, not with arrogance, but with intent, and she suspected he wasn't who he appeared to be. Whatever his true identity, she had chosen to trust him. Clifton approached her finally, his voice low but sharp as he leaned in just enough to be menacing. "Did he pay?" he asked. Marvette shook her head calmly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "No, sir." Clifton's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching. "Then you better pray he does," he growled before turning away, his polished smile snapping back into place as he greeted another table of wealthy white diners. Langston noticed the exchange but remained seated, his expression unchanging, his mind cataloging every detail. He knew the game, knew the silent rules that dictated who was believed, who was trusted, and who was treated as suspect. And now, by ordering the most expensive dish in the restaurant without prepayment, he had forced their hand. had exposed the pressure points of a system designed not to serve, but to judge. He waited patiently, calm as ever, while in the kitchen the charade unfolded. Marvette returned briefly, her hands folded at her apron, her voice steady as she confirmed the order. Langston nodded in acknowledgement, offering no more than a soft thank you. But his gaze lingered on her for just a second longer, enough to let her know he understood the risk she had taken. She inclined her head slightly before moving away, her expression unreadable, but her heart racing. The presidential prime was not merely a dish to them. It was a performance, a showpiece carried out in front of wealthy diners to prove that the cradle belonged among the elite. But in the hands of Derek and Eldon it had become something darker, a ritual twisted into humiliation when the wrong kind of customer dared to order it. Derek waited until the marbled meat sizzled. Then with casual cruelty, he spat on it, a thick glob landing on the flesh before he flipped it over as though nothing had happened. Eldon laughed louder now, muttering a comment about teaching people to stay in their place, and the rest of the line cooks, though not all complicit, said nothing, their silence sealing the culture as firmly as any policy could. Marvette Cole stood just inside the doorway, holding an empty tray, her breath caught in her throat as she watched the act unfold, her chest tightening with rage and nausea. She had seen things before, jokes about undercooking meat for black customers, muttered slurs when the manager was out of earshot. But this was different. This was targeted, deliberate, and it was happening right in front of her after she had just risked her position by overriding the system to honor Langston Pryor's order. For a moment she froze, torn between denial and recognition. But when she saw Eldon slap Derek on the back like two frat boys congratulating each other, she knew she had not misinterpreted it. This was intentional. This was contempt made tangible. Her instinct was to scream, to confront, to grab the plate and hurl it to the ground. But years of swallowing her pride had taught her the cost of defiance. Clifton would fire her on the spot. Derek would laugh in her face. The cradle would go on unchanged. But tonight something was different inside her. Tonight she had already crossed the line by warning Langston with that folded napkin, and though fear still clutched at her ribs, she knew she could not stay silent now. She stepped back, gripping her tray tighter, her mind racing for a way to protect him without drawing immediate attention. Her eyes darted to the linen napkins stacked neatly on the rack, to the pen tucked in her apron pocket, and she knew what she had to do. She moved swiftly, grabbing a fresh napkin and unfolding it against the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she scribbled words that burned hotter than any dish in that kitchen. They spit in your food. This place is not safe. Ask to see the kitchen cameras. The ink bled into the fabric, her strokes uneven with urgency, but the message was clear. She folded it twice, pressing it flat so it looked no different than any other napkin, then slipped it into her pocket just as Derek plated the steak beneath a gleaming silver dome, hiding the contamination beneath a show of refinement. When the plate was handed to her, Marvette felt her pulse hammer against her throat. She steadied her hands, balanced the tray, and walked toward the dining room, every step measured, her face betraying nothing though inside she was torn between terror and determination. The restaurant hummed with low conversation, glasses clinking, forks scraping against plates. But for Marvette, each sound was muffled, drowned out by the pounding of her heartbeat. She reached Langston's table, set the plate before him with practiced grace, and lifted the dome with the same flourish she had been trained to perform, the smoke curling upward as if mocking her with its theatrics. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly, her tone perfectly even, her posture perfectly still. He nodded politely, giving no sign that he understood anything unusual had just transpired. As she cleared the bread plate with her right hand, her left slipped the folded napkin beneath the edge of his setting, sliding it into place with a movement so fluid it looked like nothing more than part of a routine. Then she was gone, gliding toward another table without breaking stride, without glancing back, without betraying the storm raging inside her. To anyone else in the room, nothing unusual had happened. To Langston, who waited a few seconds before moving, the world had just shifted. He sat still, staring at the plate before him, the steak untouched, his knife and fork lying idle. He let the silence stretch, sensing the tension in the air, reading the unspoken message not only in the napkin but in Marvette's body language, the slight tremor in her hands, the urgency in her movements. He reached forward slowly, sliding the napkin into his palm, unfolding it beneath the cover of the tablecloth. The words hit him like a strike of lightning. They spit in your food. This place is not safe. Ask to see the kitchen cameras. Langston's jaw tightened, his face turning into stone. He had traveled the world, eaten in roadside stalls and luxury hotels alike, endured far worse than bad food, but it wasn't the spit that chilled him. It was the phrase, "This place is not safe." That was bigger than one contaminated steak. That was systemic. That was culture. That was exactly what the anonymous letter had warned him about. And now it was written in the trembling hand of a young black waitress risking everything to tell him the truth. He folded the napkin carefully, slipped it into his hoodie pocket, and pushed the plate away untouched. He did not rise in outrage, did not call for the manager, did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached for his burner phone, opened the secure app he used for sensitive operations, and typed quickly. Red flag at the cradle. Pull kitchen camera backups for tonight. Cross-check staff records. Quiet, fast, full report. The message flew across encrypted servers to his security team in New York, and within minutes they would begin extracting digital evidence. Langston knew better than to confront the problem with noise. Power did its work in silence first. Across the dining room, Clifton watched him, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tight, suspicion flickering across his face. He saw Langston push the plate aside, saw his calm expression, and for the first time something unsettled him. He strode over, his smile forced. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked, his tone honeyed, but his eyes calculating. Langston looked up, his voice smooth but cold. "I'd like to speak to you privately. About the meal." Clifton gestured toward a hallway lined with framed awards and certificates. Langston followed, but he did not sit. Clifton blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time that evening. He stammered something about the cameras being for inventory only, about feeds looping automatically, about approvals that had to be requested. Langston didn't move, his gaze steady, his posture a wall of quiet authority. "That's fine," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "Let's start with tonight's footage, specifically when my steak was prepared." The demand landed heavy, and Clifton's eyes darted to the corner of the room as though searching for an escape. For years, Clifton had coasted on charm and intimidation, confident that his smile could smooth over any conflict, and that his power in the restaurant shielded him from consequences. But in front of Langston, that confidence cracked. He fiddled with the keys at his belt, stalling, claiming the archive was disorganized, that it might take time to locate the right segment. Langston stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut like a knife. "You have one chance to do this clean. Either you help uncover a problem in your house, or you prove yourself part of the rot." Clifton swallowed hard, sweat already forming at his temples, and he fumbled with the lock to a drawer, pulling out a dusty hard drive. He plugged it into the monitor, the screen flickering to life as files scrolled past. Langston crossed his arms, his expression unreadable as Clifton opened the footage. For a moment, the grainy black and white video showed the prep station clearly, chefs moving in and out of frame, the familiar chaos of a busy kitchen. But then, abruptly, the feed jumped. 2 minutes and 12 seconds vanished in a clean cut, right at the moment when Derek Vance had leaned over the steak. Clifton tapped the keyboard nervously, pretending it was a glitch, muttering about technical issues. Langston's voice cut through the excuses with a single word: "Enough." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clifton looked up, caught in Langston's unblinking stare, and in that instant he understood that the man in front of him was not just another diner. Langston leaned forward, his voice calm but cold. "You're stalling and you're lying. Who exactly do you think you're speaking to?" Clifton's mouth opened, then closed again, his throat dry. Finally, desperate, he asked, "Sir, if I may, who are you?" Langston's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile without warmth. He leaned in close, his words landing like a hammer. "I'm the man who signs your checks. And if I hear one more lie fall out of your mouth, you won't have another one to cash." The blood drained from Clifton's face, his bravado evaporating. For the first time in his career at the cradle, he felt powerless. Outside the office, the dining room carried on as if nothing had changed, forks clinking against plates, wine glasses raised in toasts. But inside the office, the entire balance of power had shifted. Clifton tried one last protest, claiming the footage must have been corrupted, that the system was old, that memory sometimes cycled without warning. Langston pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb flying across the secure app, sending a message to his security team. Partial footage. Possible tampering. Flag Clifton Morrow. Preserve all files. Begin interviews. He slipped the phone back into his hoodie and turned his gaze back to Clifton, who now stood sweating, his composure unraveling. "You're done for tonight," Langston said flatly. "Walk me out, then go home. And if you're smart, you'll call a lawyer." Clifton opened his mouth to argue, but the icy certainty in Langston's voice froze the words before they left his throat. He nodded mutely, fumbling to gather his belongings as Langston stepped past him, pushing the office door open into the warm glow of the dining room. The contrast between the world outside, the laughter, the music, the polite clinking of silverware, and the tension inside was jarring. As Clifton trailed behind, Langston strode through the restaurant with a quiet authority that made even the most oblivious diners glance up in curiosity. He moved with the confidence of a man who no longer needed to pretend, the mask of anonymity slipping away to reveal the CEO beneath. When they reached the front, Langston stopped at the threshold, turning back just enough for Clifton to hear his final words. "This place is finished as you know it. Pray that you're not finished with it." Then he stepped out into the night air, leaving Clifton pale and shaken in the doorway. The drive back to his hotel was silent, the city lights blurring past as Langston's thoughts raced. He had not needed to see the missing footage to know what had happened. Marvette's warning, Derek's smirk, Eldon's laugh, they were all pieces of the same poison puzzle. But the deliberate cut in the footage was confirmation of something deeper. This was not an isolated act of cruelty. This was a system protecting itself, a system willing to erase truth to preserve power. And Langston Pryor, who had clawed his way from a childhood of scarcity to an empire of influence, knew exactly how to dismantle systems like that. By the time he reached his suite, his security team had already delivered the uncut backups. He sat at the desk, glass of water in hand, as he opened the files. There, crystal clear, was Derek Vance leaning over the stake, spitting with full intent, then turning to Eldon with a smirk. The audio was faint but audible. "That's what you get for acting like you belong here." Langston leaned back in his chair, his face expressionless. He felt no shock, no outrage, only the cold clarity of confirmation. This was not a mistake. This was culture, sanctioned by silence, protected by management, repeated without consequence. And tonight, with Marvette's courage and his team's evidence, that culture had signed its own death warrant. He encrypted the files, sending copies to both his legal and PR teams, and attached a simple message: full internal review, staff interviews, emergency compliance audit, hold statements until my word, prepare for exposure. Then he closed the laptop and stared out at the Charleston skyline, the twinkling lights masking the city's scars. The cradle thought it could humiliate him, thought it could erase its sins with a cut in the footage. But instead it had handed him proof, so damning it would not only dismantle the restaurant, but force a reckoning across the entire brand. Langston's eyes narrowed as the video played, the camera fixed on the prep station, and there was Derek Vance, the head chef who strutted through the kitchen with arrogance, leaning over the sizzling Wagyu steak, the same steak Langston had ordered to test this place. And without hesitation, Derek spat on it, his face twisting into a sneer that spoke of both cruelty and entitlement. Eldon Pritchard appeared beside him, laughing with that high, mocking tone that carried disdain as clearly as the word themselves. And together they acted not as rogue individuals, but as men completely at home in a system that rewarded contempt when aimed downward at people like Langston. The audio, faint but amplified by Langston's team, confirmed what Marvette had feared. Derek muttered, "That's what you get for acting like you belong here," and Eldon chuckled his agreement. Langston paused the footage, his jaw tight, but his pulse steady. Because rage was not his weapon, clarity was. He resumed the video and saw more earlier clips from the same week uncovered by his team. A black couple seated in the far corner of the dining room had waited nearly 30 minutes longer than their white counterparts, their server apologizing repeatedly as the kitchen dragged its feet. When their food finally came, the steak had been tossed carelessly on the floor first, then thrown back on the grill, a cruel joke that no one outside the kitchen ever knew. Another clip showed Marvette herself, scheduled on back-to-back doubles, rushing from table to table, while Derek mocked her behind her back, his words laced with venom as Eldon laughed. This wasn't a single incident, wasn't a glitch, wasn't a rogue act by one chef on one night. It was systemic, normalized, embedded in the DNA of the Cradle's operations, and Langston knew at once that the anonymous letter he had received had barely scratched the surface of the truth. He saved the files, encrypting them on 2 separate servers, one routed to his legal team and one to his PR strategists, attaching only a brief message: undeniable evidence. Prepare for immediate containment and controlled exposure. No leaks until I speak. He closed the laptop gently, stood, and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights blinking against the dark, each one a reminder of the people who lived beneath them. People who had walked into restaurants like the Cradle and been treated as less. People who had served within those walls and been humiliated silently because they feared losing what little they had. He thought of Marvette, her trembling hands as she slipped him that napkin, her courage in risking her livelihood for the sake of truth. And he knew that the Real story was not about him, not about his billions, not even about Derek Vance or Clifton Morrow. The story was about her, about every quiet witness who had been forced into silence by fear. Langston's phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a secure message from his chief of security. Footage confirmed. Tampering by local staff. Evidence preserved. Full report ready. Another message came seconds later from his legal counsel. This will hold up in court. Recommend immediate suspension of management pending review. Langston typed a swift reply. No suspension. Removal. We control the narrative, not them. He set the phone down, his mind already assembling the plan. This would not be handled behind closed doors. The Cradle had functioned for too long on the illusion of exclusivity, hiding its rot under velvet and gold. To dismantle it required more than legal strategy. It required exposure, a light so bright that no shadow could survive. He sat back down and reviewed the footage again, not because he needed convincing, but because he understood the importance of detail. Every frame mattered. Every sneer, every laugh, every careless act of cruelty would become part of the case he would present, part of the story he would tell the world. He took notes, timestamps, details, his precision as sharp as it had been in the early days when he built his first company from nothing but an old computer and determination. Success had not dulled his instincts. If anything, it had refined them. And now, as he prepared to confront this culture of rot, he felt the same fire he had carried as a boy when he refused to let the world reduce him to the limits it tried to impose. He thought again of Clifton's pale face in that office, the way the manager had stuttered and stalled, the arrogance crumbling as soon as Langston revealed who he was. That mask had fallen easily, and Langston knew the same would happen when Derek and Eldon were confronted. Men like them thrived on silence, on the complicity of others, but once exposed they collapsed under the weight of their own cowardice. And yet Langston felt no triumph in that thought, only grim determination. Removing individuals was not enough. The culture itself had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He poured himself another glass of water, the sound loud in the quiet of a suite, and sat in reflection. He thought of his mother, of the nights she came home from cleaning other people's floors, her hands raw, her back bent, yet her eyes steady as she told him he would rise above it. He thought of his grandmother, who had held him steady when the world mocked him for dreaming too high. He thought of the boy he had been, staring at a second-hand computer and teaching himself to code, determined to carve a place where none had been offered. That boy would never have been allowed into the Cradle's dining room except as staff, and even now, with billions behind his name, the first instinct of this place was to seat him by the kitchen doors and spit in his food. That was the truth of America's unfinished work. And tonight Langston was determined to force the reckoning. The night stretched on as he prepared. He drafted outlines for his legal team, structured a press strategy with precise language, and listed every staff member to be interviewed. He noted Marvette's name separately, not to protect her from scrutiny, but to ensure her courage was recognized, elevated, and rewarded. He wrote instructions that she was not to be disciplined, but offered a new position in oversight, a role that would give her both authority and protection. She had taken the first step. He would ensure she was never silenced again. She had not slept, not after what she had done, not after slipping that napkin beneath Langston's bread plate, not after watching Derek spit on the steak and Eldon laugh as though humiliation were part of the recipe. She had replayed it all 1,000 times in her mind, wondering if she had been foolish, wondering if courage had finally crossed the line into recklessness. And yet, as she walked down the long hallway toward the manager's office, her legs stiff, her breath shallow, she told herself she would face it. She had chosen to act, and whatever the consequences, she would not regret telling the truth. When she pushed open the door, she braced herself for Clifton's slick hair and false grin. Instead, she found a man standing tall near the desk, still in the same plain hoodie and sneakers he had worn the night before, but the air around him was different now, heavier, commanding. He was no longer simply the calm customer at table 14. He radiated control. "Marvette Cole," Langston said, his voice even but resonant, and he gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, her knees nearly buckling, and whispered, "I know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." He raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You should have," he replied. "And you did." Those words struck her harder than any reprimand could have. Her throat tightened, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She sank into the chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "Am I being fired?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Langston shook his head slowly, a hint of something like amusement tugging at his lips. "Not by me," he said. "Not ever by me." She frowned in confusion. "I don't understand." Langston's gaze locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. "I own this place," he said, the revelation landing like thunder. "The building, the brand, the people who run it, they answer to me." Marvette's eyes widened, her breath catching as the reality set in. The man she had risked everything to warn, the man she thought might not even be able to pay for the steak, was the man who controlled the entire empire. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into the chair fully, stunned. He continued, his tone calm but firm. "I reviewed the footage. I've seen what happened in that kitchen. I've seen what has been happening here for months, maybe years. You didn't have to tell anyone. You didn't have to risk anything. But you did. And because you did, this truth came to me directly." Marvette dropped her gaze to the floor, her voice shaking. "I didn't know who else to tell. I just couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't stand by anymore." Langston leaned forward, his expression softening just enough to strip away some of her fear. "And you didn't. That's what matters. You did more than most people ever would." He exhaled, as though weighing his next words carefully. "So here's the truth. I can have this entire place shut down today. I can fire everyone, rebrand the business, and start fresh. And I will if I must. But before I do that, I need one thing from you." Marvette's heart pounded, her palms clammy. "What?" she whispered. Langston's eyes held hers, steady, unblinking. "A choice." The word hung between them, heavy, electric. Marvette leaned forward slightly, searching his face for meaning. Langston's voice lowered, deliberate. "You can walk away quietly. I'll make sure you're taken care of. A scholarship, a new job, whatever you need. You'll never have to set foot in this place again." Marvette swallowed hard, the offer almost too good to be real. To return to her dream, to finish her law degree, to escape this suffocating cycle. It was everything she had once prayed for. And yet, before she could respond, Langston continued. "Or," he said, his tone sharpening, "you can stay. Help me rebuild this place from the inside, from scratch, as the new director of ethics and culture." The transformation of the cradle began not with quiet memos or hushed firings, but with a thunderclap of consequence delivered in full daylight. and Langston Pryor orchestrated it with the same precision that had built his empire. Because he understood that to dismantle a culture of rot, you could not simply remove a few pieces behind closed doors. You had to expose the entire system to light until there was nowhere left for shadows to hide. Just 24 hours after Marvette Cole made her choice to stay and help rebuild, the doors of the Cradle were shut to customers, but opened wide to truth. At precisely noon, as the lunch crowd of Charleston's elite trickled toward the steps in their press suits and polished shoes, two unmarked black SUVs pulled to a stop outside the grand entrance. Federal compliance officers in plain clothes stepped out, their presence calm but unflinching, and without a word they pushed through the front doors, their eyes already fixed on the kitchen. Derek Vance had barely begun sharpening his knives for the day when they arrived. He looked up, his smirk faltering as they identified themselves. Eldon Pritchard tried to slip toward the back exit, but another officer intercepted him. Within minutes, both men were led out the front, still in their stained aprons, their heads ducked but their shame visible to every onlooker. Clifton Morrow followed, his once slick smile replaced by a pale mask of fear. For years, he had controlled this house through intimidation and silence, but today's silence no longer protected him. He was walked out the same doors through which he had once strutted, and the staff watched in stunned silence as their manager was taken like any other man caught in wrongdoing. Langston stepped outside only after the arrests were complete, his plain hoodie replaced now by a tailored suit that matched the gravity of the moment, his posture calm but commanding as reporters swarmed with cameras and microphones. He had not summoned them with press releases. They had come because truth had a way of attracting witnesses, and when he stood at the podium hastily set up on the steps, the world leaned in to listen. He spoke without fury, without theatrics, his words steady, his tone a scalpel cutting through excuses. "Yesterday, I entered this building as a customer," he began. "Today I stand before you as its owner. What I saw, what I uncovered, does not reflect the values of Devo Holdings, nor does it reflect the values of this community. This was not the result of one bad apple. This was the result of a poison tree, and today we begin the work of cutting it down." Behind him, staff gathered hesitantly, some whispering, some simply staring, and among them stood Marvette, no longer in a faded uniform, but in a navy blouse and slacks, the simple attire of someone stepping into authority. Langston gestured toward her. "This woman," he said, his voice rising slightly, "showed more integrity in one night than most executives show in a career. She risked everything to tell the truth, and because of her, justice has arrived at the Cradle." The applause that followed was not polite or forced. It was raw, spontaneous, a release of pressure built over years of silence. Some staff clapped hesitantly, others with tears in their eyes, and Marvette stood tall, her hands folded, her heart pounding, knowing that for the first time in her life she was being seen not as a server, but as a voice that mattered. The days that followed were a storm of activity. The Cradle remained closed to the public, but the inside buzzed with the chaos of dismantling and rebuilding. The Confederate portraits were removed and replaced with photographs of Charleston's black pioneers, chefs, artists, community leaders whose names had been erased from the city's glossy narratives, but whose legacies demanded honor. The kitchen was gutted, scrubbed, redesigned, the rot torn out not just from the walls, but from the policies that had allowed cruelty to thrive. Marvette sat at the desk that had once belonged to Clifton, the plaque on the door now reading Director of Ethics and Culture. And though the title felt heavy at first, Langston reminded her it was more than paperwork, it was presence. She held staff-wide meetings in the dining room, not at long tables of hierarchy, but in circles where every voice could be heard. She told them what had happened, not with shame, but with strength, explaining that silence was never neutral, that complicity was a choice, and that if they were to move forward, they would do it together. She established anonymous reporting channels, scheduled mandatory bias training, and insisted on weekly feedback sessions where grievances were not dismissed but addressed. Some resisted, some whispered behind her back, but most listened, and slowly the atmosphere shifted. For the first time, the staff saw someone who looked like them, who had endured what they endured, now sitting at the head of the table shaping the future. At night, Marvette returned to her small apartment. exhaustion still heavy, but different now. Not the exhaustion of humiliation, but of responsibility. Langston had offered to cover her tuition if she wanted to return to law school, and she had said yes, enrolling part-time. By day, she rebuilt the cradle's culture. By night, she pursued the dreams she had abandoned, determined to ensure that her mother's sacrifices were not wasted. Langston checked in frequently, not to hover, but to support, reminding her that leadership was not about perfection but persistence. He stood by her side when she faltered, but he let her own the victories. Together they forged a partnership rooted not in hierarchy, but in respect. When the cradle reopened weeks later, it was not the same place. Gone were the velvet drapes that muffled exclusion. In their place hung art that celebrated inclusion. The chandeliers still shone, but the glow was no longer reserved for white diners and pearls. It illuminated a space open to all. The seating chart was no longer a map of silent segregation. Guests of every background filled the room, greeted warmly, seated fairly, served with dignity. Reporters returned, curious to see if the promises of change were more than words, and they left with stories not of scandal, but of transformation. And at the center of it all was Marvette, her voice steady as she explained the new systems, her presence a living reminder that integrity could indeed reshape an institution. Langston watched it all with quiet pride, but he knew the greater message extended beyond these walls. When he spoke publicly about the ordeal, he did not frame it as a business problem or a PR crisis. He framed it as a human truth. Sometimes change begins not with a protest or a lawsuit, he said in one televised interview, but with a folded napkin and someone brave enough to write the truth on it. The responsibility of those in power is to listen, to act, and to protect those voices rather than silence them. His words traveled far beyond Charleston, inspiring conversations in boardrooms, universities, and households about the hidden layers of bias that still haunted places of privilege. For Marvette, the journey was personal. She no longer walked with her eyes lowered or her voice muted. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had faced fear and chosen courage. And when new hires joined the cradle, she told them the story of that night not to frighten them, but to remind them that integrity mattered, that silence was dangerous, and that even the smallest act of truth could ignite change. She often ended those meetings with the same sentence: "If I could risk everything on one napkin, you can risk something for what's right too." Langston knew he could have destroyed the cradle entirely, rebranded it, erased its name from history, but he chose instead to rebuild, to prove that even poisoned soil could be renewed when watered with courage and justice. And though profits and press clippings mattered to his empire, this victory was measured differently. It was measured in the look of dignity on Marvette's face, in the applause of staff who finally felt seen, in the knowledge that a system once built on exclusion now carried the blueprint of inclusion. In the end, justice did not arrive as a grand explosion, but as a steady flame that spread from one folded napkin, a flame that revealed the rot, burned away the lies, and illuminated the path forward. The cradle had once been a stage for white privilege, but now it stood as a testament to what could happen when someone refused to remain silent and someone in power chose to listen. For Langston Pryor and Marvette Cole, the story was no longer about food. It was about courage. It was about the truth that dignity was not a luxury reserved for some, but a right owed to all. And that truth, once spoken, could not be erased. The end. If this story kept you reading all the way through, let me know your thoughts. Was the ending what you expected, or did it take you by surprise? I'd love to hear where you're watching from and how you felt about the twists in the plot. If you want more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next release. And give a like to help it reach others who enjoy meaningful storytelling built on suspense and justice.